Our final keynote speaker for this session, Tim Waterman, Professor of Landscape Theory and Acting Director of Architecture, History and Theory at the Finalist School of Architecture, UCLA.
Thank you, Manolo. Right, so thank you so much to the Biennial and all the organizers. I can't do better than Eulalia did earlier with all her list of thank yous, so I'll just reinforce those. It's wonderful to be here. It's an honor and it's a privilege to address you all. So I'm going to talk through the idea of the poetics of remediation by kind of paring it down a little bit. And I'm going to read you a poem, and then I'm going to speak about what we might mean by a remedy and what remediation might possibly be about. So I'm going to talk about poetics and what that means. And poetics is a theory of structure. It's a theory of structure, form, and discourse within literature, and in particular within poetry. And I think that we have these same kinds of structures when we look at landscapes as not merely ecological, but social, cultural, and aesthetic artifacts. So poetics becomes a way in which we can address landscapes and think through them. And I think also think through them in ways that are profoundly ethical. So when I teach theory, and the way that we teach theory at the Bartlett School of Architecture is that it's very much part of the language of design, and also I think with the awareness that we need ideas alongside design more than ever. We need to think very carefully about what we do as landscape architects and in landscape architecture with communities and in everyday life. So I'm going to read this poem. Let's see, which is by Jake Adam York, who's a Southern United States poet. Died young, but left us with a really marvelous body of poetic work. And the poem is called Grace. And grace is the remedy that I want to speak about. It's an aesthetic and cultural remedy, and it's something that we give to each other, and I think that is, it's not something that comes down on high in landscapes. Grace is something we give to each other. So, in order to understand the poem, there's a couple of mentions of the civil rights movement, which I think is important nowadays as well, to remember that landscape has a profoundly political medium, and that in order to do landscape well, we have to think well, and we also have to do good politics. So we actually now, I think, have to insist on landscape thinking in the face of the rise of neo-fascism and the far right, and it's important to use our knowledge to counter that. So this speaks about Medgar Evers, who was assassinated outside his home in 1963. It speaks of the 1965 Selma to Montgomery March for Civil Rights. And it speaks about the town of Birmingham, Alabama, which is an iron and steel town. So I think that you'll get a little hint of iron and steel in this poem. So, Grace by Jake Adam York. Because my grandmother made me the breakfast her mother made her, when I crack the eggs, pat the butter on the toast, and remember the bacon, to cast iron, to fork, to plate, to tongue, my great-grandmother moves my hands to whisk, to spatula, to biscuit ring, and I move her hands too, making her mess, so the syllable of batter I'll find tomorrow beneath the fridge, and the strew of salt and oil are all memorials, like the pan-fried chicken that whistles in the grease in the voice of my best friend's grandmother, and the smoke from the grill is the smell of my father coming home from the furnace, and the tang of vinegar and char is the smell of Birmingham, the smell of coming home, of history, redolent as the salt of black and white film, when I unwrap the sandwich from the wax paper crackling like the cold grass along the Selma to Montgomery Road, like the foil that held Medgar's last meal, a square of tin that is just the ghost of that barbecue, I can imagine to my tongue when I stand at the pit with my brother and think of all the hands and mouths and breaths of air that sharpened this flavor and handed it down to us. I feel all those hands inside my hands when it's time to spread the table linen or lift a coffin rail. And when the smoke billows from the pit, I think of my uncle. I think of my uncle rising, not falling, when I raise the buttermilk and the cornmeal to the light before giving them to the skillet. And sometimes I say the recipe to the air, and sometimes I say his name, or her name, or her name, and sometimes I just set the table. Because meals are memorials that teach us how to move. History moves in us as we raise our voices and then our glasses. To pour a little out for those who poured out everything for us, we pour ourselves for them so they can eat again. I think that poem talks to us a little bit about everyday life and about the act of building. That building is something we do together, that landscapes are something that we create together. And Henry Wotton's translation of Vitruvius from 1624, and by the way, Ribes Piera left in the collection at Etzaba an antique edition of Vitruvius, which I would love to see. But this idea of firmness, commodity, and delight is something, perhaps that we find in meals, but we also find in landscapes, and it's fundamentally about building. And landscapes are buildings, at least the way when we look at them, they are. So let's think about this term, firmness, commodity, and delight. Now, Henry Wotton kind of got it quite wrong, actually. It's a very poor translation. In the original, in Vitruvius, firmness, commodity, and delight are firmitas, commoditas, and venustas. So firmitas makes sense. Like a building needs to be firm, a landscape needs to be solid, it needs to withstand floods, it needs to withstand fire. Commoditas, maybe better to think of that as utilitas. It's commodity but also utility. Does it work? Does it do what we need it to do? Then venustas. Venustas is quite delightful because it's not just delight, it's so much more beyond it. So let me talk through venustas and what that might mean. And let's look at Botticelli. I think he's a great place to start because at the center of this painting from the 1400s, you have Venus standing there amidst a landscape, a fully elaborated botanical landscape. There are some 500 species of plants that have been counted in this one painting, more than 100 of them flowering. And they're in the foreground, and they're in the dress of Flora, who's standing just to the right of Venus. So let's talk about Venustas. So Venustas is all the qualities of Venus. Art historians are at a loss to explain this painting in detail, but I think actually the qualities of Venus are visible in this painting. So it may not have been the original intention, but it helps us to think it through. So just next to Venus, we have the three graces. And the three graces, one of the symbols of the three graces are the idea of a gift economy, of a moral economy, of a circular economy, which I think speaks very much to the work of contemporary landscape. So giving, receiving, and returning. I think we could also say that maybe the three graces nowadays are reduce, reuse, recycle as well. So also among the qualities of Venus, we have beauty. Now, actually, this is Botticelli was being extremely flattering here because this is one of the Medicis that's been painted as Mercury, and actually he's not really that good looking at all. So very flattering in this picture. But also of the qualities of Venus, we have love. So there's Cupid giving us a bit of love from above. And then we also have the idea of charm, of luck, and of grace, which I just read to you about in the poem. And then grace, of course, is also deeply connected to the idea of gratitude. And the gratitude that we have illustrated in this painting is gratitude to nature, gratitude to the wealth of abundance that landscape gives us. And I think one of the things that's important for us as landscape architects is to think through actually how we help nature to give us more. Our part in nature is to expand upon it. So how is a meal like a landscape? So I spoke about the barbecue in Jake Adam York, and I spoke about passing things into the future and remembering the past. And meals are everyday occurrences. But if meals are memorials, what that does is it says to us that everyday life is of incredible value. So that barbecue that you might design for in the landscape is such an important moment, such an important act. So those moments in everyday life pull the past into the future. And it's the memory and those ideas that are so important to us when we design for landscapes. Okay, lots of words on this slide, and I'm not going to read them all. But Henri Lefebvre talks about the everyday construction of landscape and the fact that these are works over time. Lefebvre talks about the œuvre of landscape. And right down at the very end, I think we see that we're faced necessarily with a new imperative, the practical, effective transformation of things as they are. So all sorts of things happening in the corporate world, the idea of disruption and restructuring, move fast and break things. Actually, what we really need to do with landscapes is move slowly and thoughtfully and mend things. And these things are in the everyday. And I think you can see as well, we've got the last few lines from Jake Adam York. Basically, that what we do, the work that we do in landscape is not about delivering something that's scenic, but about picking up on everyday life, working with processes, working with relationships over time. And I think that's something that we very much saw in the Ribes Piera School Prize judging, is that one of the things that's happening wonderfully, delightfully in schools of landscape architecture now is a focus upon design with relationships rather than just forms. Not that we've set aside form, but the idea of relationships has really moved quite centrally, and I think that's transformed the work that's coming out of landscape architecture schools magnificently. It's such an exciting thing to see that, and I can't wait for you to see the winners tonight. So also a line from J.B. Jackson, and perhaps a reminder here too that it's really only the late 20th century that has given us the idea of landscape that is so valuable for us to work with. And I think here too you can see the idea of venustas at work. Maybe you can see all those qualities, firmitas, commoditas, and venustas here. Hard work, stubborn hope, and mutual forbearance, striving to be love. It isn't always love in the landscape, but it's trying to be. So let me go back to Henri Lefebvre for a moment and talk about what it means to think about grace and how we give that to each other and how we provide that through landscapes. And I want you to imagine for me that it's summer, and this is, okay, so this is to explain the Lefebvrean moment, which is an expanded moment. It's a moment of cultural and ecological surplus. It's a utopian moment. So you're standing in the strawberry patch and it's summer, and the sun is hot on your neck. And you reach down below the shadow of a leaf to pluck a strawberry from the shade, and in the sun you get that fragrance and that sweetness and the juiciness of the strawberry as you bite into it. Maybe the juice runs down your chin a little. And it's that moment where you remember that you're grateful for those who've given you this landscape, who've given the work into the soil, who have provided a better strawberry for you to eat by generations of making better strawberries. And it reminds you of your gift to the future that you have to give to make a better strawberry and to tend that landscape and to design for the future. So that, I think, is where the Lefebvrean moment, that expanded moment of cultural surplus, also becomes a moment of grace and an act for the future. Catherine Schoenfield, in her, another person who died too young, but who left us with wonderful words for the future, she says it's right in front of us. Our best dream for the future yet to come is a new conception of what we already have. And I think that's one of the things that we're trying so much to do with our work in landscape, is to give people that which is right in front of them as a gift for the future. And I think also we can think about poetics and structure that landscape give us, but also that design give us, through this quote by Audre Lorde, that it is through poetry that we give names to those ideas that are, until the poem is written, nameless and formless. You could put design in that phrase and say, it is through design we give names to those ideas. So our acts as landscape designers are to picture and speak the future and the forms that that future will take. So again, grace is fundamental to what we do in our field. And I want to end just by showing you a very brief project. And this one perhaps doesn't connect to barbecues and doesn't connect to meals, but this is just the most beautiful piece of thesis work from last year's class. We have about 50 students in each year, so about 100 students in total at the Bartlett School of Architecture. And this is by Ana Garrido Chavez. And she came to us. We have a conversion program, so we get a wide variety of students coming from different disciplines into landscape architecture. And when I first started teaching on conversions, I thought, oh, you know, they couldn't possibly be as good, these students who come through the program, as the students that have done a full undergraduate study of landscape architecture and then the postgraduate. But actually, they're amazing, because what they do is they bring a diversity of ideas and knowledges to landscape, and they teach each other so much, and they teach me so much. So I absolutely, they're hard to teach because they're so diverse. But that diversity, I think, is also part of what gives us grace. Human diversity, biodiversity, all hugely important. So this is a piece of work where she came into the school as a dancer. She came into landscape architecture as a dancer. And when she had originally had some very sort of dry, dull plans for her thesis. And I said, Anna, why don't you dance your thesis? And she did, and she danced it with the most incredible theoretical and philosophical rigor. She thought about every move she was going to make in the landscape and how we think through the landscape and through our bodies and our interactions to it. And she brought it very much back to design. So I'll just show you a couple of images. She did this wonderful kind of preparation for each one of her dances. And she worked in an experimental forest that we work with at the Bartlett, which is just outside of London. And each dance was prepared. Each dance included landscape analysis and evaluation. And then she did a total sort of photogrammetry of the environment with her in it. And she did a series of 3 performances, each of which encountered a different type of landscape and drew different conclusions. And she filmed each one of the dances. So, and I think there's so much of the qualities of Venustas in each one of these works: charm, beauty, grace, and I think love for the landscape that she's showing here as well. And I do think that when we teach, especially teaching landscape, it's to help students to fall in love with the world a little bit, to become more in tune with it. So here she is dancing with an ancient rhododendron, which is actually a weed tree in this particular forest. It crowds out the undergrowth. So this was the first of her performances. And then the second, she was working her way into the clearing. The clothes that she chose for the performances were very particular. And then the final performance is one where, actually, if I'd known what she was going to do, I wouldn't have allowed her to do it, but I'm glad she did because it's such a beautiful piece of work. So she dances from the center of the forest, from the densest area of the forest, through to the clearing, and then to the forest margin, which in this case is the road. So she does this amazing dance on this narrow verge of the road, where the traffic is just coming right past her. And so she wrote afterwards about the kind of fearful experience of that. And it's just the most remarkable thing to see. So I just want to end with just a few lines from a poem by Gloria Ansaldúa, which I think is a lovely way of thinking about the way that we give grace to each other in landscape architecture, and about the kind of collaboration that we need, that we can't be the masters of all we survey in the way that the previous generations used to think they could be. We've got to talk to each other. We've got to build understanding. We've got to speak in language that is accessible, and we have to talk about ideas with each other if we are going to make a better future. So we don't want to be stars, but parts of constellations. Thank you.